Picture this, it's the fall of 1945. The war in Europe is over. Hitler is dead. Berlin is rubble. And the world is staring down a question nobody has ever really answered before: what do you do with the men who built a machine of mass murder and ran it like clockwork? For years, almost nobody outside Germany understood the full scale of it. Not until Allied soldiers, American GIs, British troops, Soviet forces, started liberating the camps. Reporters walked in behind them. And what they found left grown men speechless. Not before and not after, Europe had simply never seen anything like it. So where did this trial even come from? Back in 1943, when it became clear the Allies, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, were actually going to beat Hitler, the question of what happens to the war criminals started getting real. The Soviets alone had already documented entire villages burned to the ground, mass executions, and looted museums. France and Poland had the same story. On October 30, 1943, the Allies signed the Moscow Declaration, the first official statement that war criminals would face justice. But here's the twist almost nobody expects: the Allies didn't actually agree on a trial. The Americans initially wanted to just round up the top Nazis and execute them, no court, no due process. Churchill agreed. He even sent Stalin a list of roughly 50,000 names he wanted shot without trial, arguing this should be a political statement, not a legal one. President Roosevelt went even further, suggesting the entire German population shared the blame, the origin of the idea of collective guilt. It took until 1944 for the Allies to agree there would be a real trial. And one reason they hesitated? They were nervous about what might come out in open court, including their own uncomfortable history with Germany before the war. Here's where it gets even stranger. The first attempt at something like this didn't come after World War II at all, it came after World War I. The Allies tried to put Germany on trial back then too, for the same kind of atrocities: destroyed cultural sites, the first use of poison gas. But that trial got handed over to the Germans themselves. Out of roughly 900 officers called to face justice, 90% simply didn't show up. The whole thing fizzled into nothing. Lesson learned: you can't let the accused judge themselves. So in 1945, 4 nations stepped up as prosecutors: the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. France's inclusion actually raised eyebrows. There's a famous, if probably exaggerated, story that when Germany's Field Marshal Keitel saw the French delegation at the surrender ceremony, he scoffed, "Oh, you won too?" France had been occupied, and its Vichy government had actually collaborated with the Nazis. But thanks to Charles de Gaulle's enormous popularity and the credibility of French resistance fighters on the prosecution team, France earned its seat at the table. The court convened with judges and prosecutors from all 4 powers, including American prosecutor Robert Jackson and Soviet prosecutor Roman Rudenko, both of whom would become the breakout stars of this trial. The defendants were guaranteed the right to a defense attorney, but there was a problem. German lawyers didn't want to touch this case. Defending a Nazi war criminal wasn't just a tough job, it could end your career and your reputation for the next 20 years. The court had to guarantee these lawyers immunity from future professional consequences just to get anyone to take the cases. And notably, the biggest fish of all weren't even there. Hitler killed himself before the surrender. So did his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, along with his wife and children. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS death machine, also died by suicide before he could be captured. Hitler's deputy Martin Bormann simply vanished. Justice would have to settle for the men who were left. So who actually sat on trial? 21 of the Third Reich's most powerful men, and a handful of organizations, including the SS, the Gestapo, and the Nazi Party itself. At the top of the list, Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and commander of the Luftwaffe, basically Germany's air force. He became the trial's main character almost instantly, sharp-tongued, charismatic, and completely unrepentant. Beside him sat Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who'd pulled off one of the strangest stunts of the entire war, flying solo to Britain in 1941 hoping to broker peace, only to spend the rest of the war as a British prisoner. There was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who'd personally negotiated the Nazi-Soviet pact. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of Germany's military command, who would try the classic defense, "We were just following orders." Then came the true believers and the architects of atrocity. Alfred Rosenberg, the regime's self-styled philosopher, who'd built much of the ideological justification for genocide. Hans Frank, the Reich's top lawyer, whose legal frameworks had paved the way for the Holocaust itself. Julius Streicher, publisher of the viciously anti-Semitic tabloid Der Stürmer, arguably the most unhinged man in the room. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, who designed Nazi Germany's monumental buildings and later ran its war economy using slave labor. Fritz Sauckel, who'd literally been in charge of deporting millions of people for forced labor. There was also Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's navy, Erich Raeder, head of the U-boat fleet, Baldur von Schirach, who built the Hitler Youth movement, and Hans Fritzsch, the radio voice that had broadcast Nazi propaganda into German living rooms twice a week, like a hate-filled version of the evening news. On November 20, 1945, the trial officially opened. 4 charges were on the table: conspiracy to wage war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and, for the first time in legal history, crimes against humanity. The word genocide itself was coined right around this trial, used to describe what had happened to Europe's Jews, to Poland, to Soviet civilians. American Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson opened with a line that's still studied today: "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated." He warned the court that the evidence would be so overwhelming it would, in his words, rob people of sleep. And here's the part that genuinely surprised investigators: the Nazis had documented almost everything themselves. German bureaucracy was relentlessly thorough, and that thoroughness became the prosecution's biggest weapon. Mass shooting units sent detailed progress reports back to Berlin, complete with body counts and operational complaints. One unit literally wrote to headquarters proposing a more efficient mass grave system, stacking victims layer by layer to save time. Himmler approved it in writing. Instructions for gas chamber operations were filed like equipment manuals. Tons, and that's not an exaggeration, tons of paperwork survived, despite German efforts to burn and bury the evidence at the war's end. Hundreds of archivists worked around the clock sorting through it. And almost every defendant in that courtroom would try the same basic defense: "I was just a small piece of the machine. I didn't know. I had no choice." The paperwork would prove otherwise, again and again. In the trial's early weeks, the cracks started showing fast. On November 25, just days into the proceedings, Robert Ley, the man who'd run Germany's entire labor movement, was found dead in his cell, a suicide. He'd admitted regret over the regime's anti-Semitism but still defended Hitler to the end. Then came November 29. American prosecutors screened a documentary film shot inside the liberated concentration camps. Mountains of emaciated bodies. Crematorium ovens. Gas chambers. Murdered children. The courtroom that had been buzzing with Göring's jokes and sarcastic asides went dead silent. No more laughter after that. Göring, for his part, tried to turn the trial into his personal stage. On his first chance to speak, instead of a simple guilty or not guilty, he launched into a speech questioning the Allied bombing of Dresden and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, essentially arguing, "You're no angels either." The judges cut him off fast. He was clearly winning over journalists with his sharp wit and confidence, which worried prosecutors enough that they eventually had him physically separated from the other defendants at meals, just to limit his influence over the group's shared defense strategy. Meanwhile Streicher, the anti-Semitic propagandist, stood up and declared the whole trial was a conspiracy run by international Jewry, pointing out that several judges and prosecutors were Jewish. He demanded to be evaluated for insanity. The court examined him and ruled he was, in fact, fit to stand trial. Disturbing as his ideas were, they were not the product of a clinically unsound mind. He'd face the consequences of his own choices. By December 1945, things outside the courtroom were getting tense too. Just outside the Grand Hotel, where prosecutors, journalists, and intelligence officers gathered every night to unwind, a Soviet soldier was shot dead. The leading theory: it was a targeted assassination attempt against a Soviet intelligence officer, possibly orchestrated by former Nazis trying to sow chaos between the Allies. Around the same time, Soviet pilots were briefly arrested after an unauthorized landing near Nuremberg, a tense standoff that Soviet prosecutor Rudenko had to personally resolve. Despite the friction, witnesses from all sides later said the day-to-day working relationship between American, British, and Soviet teams was surprisingly functional. Still, these flare-ups showed just how fragile the wartime alliance had become, barely 6 months after Germany's surrender. Then, in early December, Göring gave an unauthorized newspaper interview that got picked up by the New York Times. That was the final straw. The court banned the press from speaking directly with any defendant for the rest of the trial. Notes could go through lawyers, but no more headlines built around Göring's personality. On a darker note, the courtroom kept hearing about the sheer reach of the Nazi killing machine. The commandant of Buchenwald, a man named Karl Koch, had kept a desk ornament made from a shrunken human head, and his guards reportedly prized lampshades crafted from tattooed human skin. His wife, later sentenced to life in prison, was implicated in selecting victims for these grim souvenirs. It was the kind of detail that turned statistics into something the human brain couldn't process any other way, a reminder that behind every number was a person. Through the winter and spring of 1946, the prosecution methodically built its case, defendant by defendant. On January 3, prosecutors unveiled reports from the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units responsible for mass executions across Eastern Europe. For the first time, the world saw documented evidence of what had happened in places like Belarus and Ukraine: systematic massacres, tortured partisans, entire communities wiped out. This wasn't hearsay anymore, it was paperwork, photographs, and even home movies some soldiers had filmed of their own crimes to show off later to family back home. In April, Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss took the stand as a witness. His testimony about the camp's gas chambers and crematoria, describing mass murder almost like a factory production problem to be solved, would later be used against IG Farben, the German industrial conglomerate, parent company to brands many Americans still recognize today, like Bayer, that manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used in the chambers. Höss described how camp officials needed an efficient method to kill at industrial scale after individual shootings proved too slow and labor-intensive, language that revealed an almost unbelievable bureaucratic coldness toward human life. Albert Speer, the architect-turned-war economy chief, testified that 80 million Germans had been poisoned by relentless state propaganda and couldn't be expected to resist it, daily newsreels before every movie, radio blaring from every corner. It was, in his words, an excuse, but also a chilling description of how total a dictatorship's grip on information can become. Late February 1946 brought one of the trial's most devastating moments. The Soviet Union screened its own documentary film of Nazi atrocities across occupied Soviet territory. Soap made from human fat. Bookbindings made from human skin. The courtroom audience reportedly fainted at points during the screening, a level of horror that, even after months of testimony, still managed to shock everyone present. Then in March, an outside event nearly derailed the whole proceeding. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, warning that the Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. The speech created an immediate and visible rift between the Soviet and Western prosecution teams. For a moment, it looked like the alliance holding the trial together might fracture entirely. The most dramatic twist, though, came when Soviet prosecutor Rudenko questioned German military leaders who claimed they'd known nothing about plans to invade the Soviet Union or exterminate Slavic populations. German defense lawyers scoffed, certain that Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, captured at Stalingrad, was either dead or a Soviet myth. Rudenko calmly said he could produce him. Days later, Paulus was flown in from Moscow and walked into the courtroom in person, stunning everyone, and delivered detailed testimony confirming that virtually the entire German military command had known about and helped plan the invasion. It was one of the trial's most theatrical, and devastating, moments for the defense. By summer, the trial was winding down. Closing arguments stretched on for months, and by the time the tribunal was ready to rule, public attention outside the courtroom had started to fade, but inside, this was the moment that mattered most. Between September 30 and October 1, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, Frank, Streicher, and Sokol, along with Martin Bormann, sentenced in absentia since his fate remained unknown. 3 defendants received life imprisonment, including Rudolf Hess, who would remain in Berlin's Spandau prison literally until his death decades later, the facility's last and only inmate by the end. Others received fixed sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. And in a result that stunned many observers, 3 defendants were fully acquitted, including Hans Fritzsch, the radio propagandist, a verdict that infuriated Soviet officials, who felt the tribunal had let some of the regime's most effective enablers walk free. Stalin himself was reportedly furious about the outcome, believing Soviet legal teams hadn't pushed hard enough and that fascism hadn't been condemned as thoroughly or as universally as he'd hoped. Still, the scale of what had been accomplished was staggering: 403 court sessions over roughly a year, 240 witnesses, around 300,000 written statements entered into evidence, and a final trial record running 16,000 pages. It remains, to this day, one of the most thoroughly documented criminal trials in human history. On October 16, 1946, 10 of the condemned were hanged at Nuremberg. Göring escaped the noose at the last moment. He died by suicide in his cell the night before, having somehow smuggled in a cyanide capsule. To this day, nobody knows for certain how he got it. But Nuremberg wasn't the end of the story. Several senior Nazis vanished into what became known as the Ratlands, escape routes through friendly regimes in Spain, Portugal, and South America. Joseph Mengele, the camp doctor infamous for his medical experiments on prisoners, lived freely in Argentina for decades before he died, never captured. Martin Bormann's remains weren't positively identified until decades later, found during construction work in Berlin. Many lower-level officials and propagandists served minimal sentences, or none at all, and quietly resumed ordinary lives in post-war Germany, some even returning to media and publishing careers. And in a twist that complicates the picture further, as the Cold War set in, both the US and the Soviet Union began recruiting former Nazi scientists and engineers for their own military and space programs, most famously rocket engineer Wernher von Braun, who went on to help build America's space program despite his wartime work using concentration camp labor. Still, Nuremberg's legacy is undeniable. It established, for the first time in history, that following orders is not a legal defense for crimes against humanity, a principle that directly shaped the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, and every international war crimes tribunal since, from the former Yugoslavia to Rwanda. As Ernest Hemingway once put it, fascism is a lie told by bullies. Nuremberg was the first time the world forced that lie into the light, and made it answer for itself.